My son kept coming home from his grandmother's house with bruises he wouldn't explain, but she insisted he was just clumsy. My 6-year-old son Oliver started coming home with bruises every Thursday after spending the day at my mother's house. First, it was just his arms. Small purple marks he said were from falling off the swing. Then darker ones on his back that he claimed happened playing tag. When I asked for details, he'd go quiet and change the subject. My mother watched him every Thursday while I worked my double shift at the warehouse. Been doing it for 2 years since my husband left. She insisted on helping. Said grandmothers were meant to care for grandchildren. Never asked for money. Always had him fed and bathed when I picked him up. Seemed like the perfect arrangement until the bruises started 3 months ago. I kept telling myself kids get hurt playing. Oliver was active, always running and climbing. But the bruises got worse each week. One Thursday, he came home with fingerprint marks on his upper arm. Asked him directly if someone grabbed him. He said he didn't remember. Started shaking when I pressed for answers. My mother said he'd been extra wild that day. Wouldn't listen. Kept trying to climb the bookshelf. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "Boys will be boys." I started documenting each bruise with photos. Bought him long sleeves to wear to school so teachers wouldn't ask questions while I figured out what was happening. Considered keeping him home on Thursdays but couldn't afford to miss work. We were already behind on rent and my mother was the only free childcare I had. Asked Oliver's teacher if she'd noticed anything concerning. She said he seemed withdrawn on Fridays, wouldn't participate in group activities, sometimes flinched when adults raised their hands to write on the board, but she'd never seen him hurt at school. No playground accidents, no fights with other kids. Whatever was happening occurred on Thursdays. I installed a recording app on Oliver's tablet without telling anyone. Gave it to him to take to Grandma's house for educational games. Hoped I'd hear something that explained the injuries. Maybe neighborhood kids were bullying him or he really was falling off equipment. Needed to know either way. Picked him up that Thursday like normal. New bruise on his shoulder blade. My mother was baking cookies, acting like nothing happened. Oliver hugged her goodbye, but I noticed he stayed arm's length away until she pulled him close. That night I listened to the tablet recording while Oliver slept. 4 hours of audio from my mother's house. At first, just normal sounds. Television, my mother asking about lunch, Oliver playing with toys. Then around hour 2, everything changed. I heard Oliver ask for juice. My mother's voice turned sharp. "You already had juice. Stop being greedy." Oliver said he was thirsty. Sound of a chair scraping. Then a smack. Oliver crying. My mother said, "Stop that whining or I'll give you something to really cry about." More crying. Another hit. "You think you can manipulate me with tears like you do your mother?" I raised 4 kids. I know when children are being dramatic. The recording continued for 2 more hours. 3 more incidents of my mother hitting him for minor things. Spilling crackers, talking too loudly during her show, and asking to call me. Each time followed by threats about what would happen if he told. "Your mother can't afford babysitters. You want her to lose her job? You want to be homeless?" My son was being trained to protect his abuser. To protect me. I drove to my mother's house at midnight. Let me in with my key. Found her watching television in her robe. She smiled when she saw me. Asked if everything was okay. I played the recording on my phone. Her face went from confusion to anger to defiance. "You recorded me in my own home?" she said. Like that was the issue. Not her beating my child. "Discipline is what that boy needs," she said. "You're too soft. Let him walk all over you. Someone has to teach him respect." I asked how long she'd been hitting him. "I don't hit," she said. "I correct. Same way I corrected you and your siblings." That's when it clicked. The bruises I'd hidden as a kid. The excuses I'd made. The fear I'd felt every time she babysat us. I'd blocked it out, convinced myself it was normal childhood stuff. Now she was doing it to Oliver. "You will never see my son again," I told her. She laughed and said I'd be back by next Thursday when I needed childcare, that I couldn't afford to lose my job over some light discipline. I told her I'd rather live in my car than let her near Oliver again. She called me ungrateful. Said she'd sacrificed her retirement years to help with Oliver. That I was throwing away family over nothing. "Beating a 6-year-old isn't nothing," I said. "It's abuse, and it stops now." Left her house and never went back. But the next morning, someone is knocking on the door. It was CPS. The woman at my door held up a badge with a photo and official seal. She said her name was Iris Aldrich and she was with Child Protective Services, here to discuss a report filed about my son. My stomach dropped, but I stepped back and let her inside. Oliver was still asleep in his room down the hall. I needed to handle this before he woke up and got scared. Iris walked in and looked around the small living room, taking in the toys on the floor and the blankets on the couch where I'd slept last night. She asked if we could sit down and talk. I led her to the kitchen table and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking. I knew exactly what was happening. My mother had called them before I could report her, trying to make me look like the problem. Iris sat across from me and pulled out a notebook. She explained that they got a report saying I was leaving Oliver in unsafe conditions and not meeting his basic needs. Her voice was calm and matter-of-fact, like she was reading from a script. I felt my face getting hot. My mother was good at this, at twisting everything to make herself look innocent. I interrupted Iris and told her I had proof that my mother had been hitting Oliver. I pulled up the recording app on my phone and said she needed to hear this right now, that everything would make sense once she listened. Iris nodded and took my phone. I watched her face as the recording played, trying to read her expression. She stayed neutral the whole time, even when my mother's voice came through clear as day, hitting Oliver and threatening him. 4 hours of audio played while we sat there. I couldn't listen to it again. Just knowing Iris was hearing every smack and cry made me feel sick. When the recording ended, Iris handed back my phone and started asking questions. She wanted to know about the bruises, when they started, how often they happened. She asked why I waited so long to report it. I explained about the money problems, how I couldn't afford to miss work or pay for childcare, how I only found out 2 days ago that my mother was actually hitting him, not just being rough. I showed her the photos I'd taken of Oliver's bruises over the past 3 months, all dated and saved in a folder. Iris wrote everything down, but I couldn't tell what she was thinking. She asked about my work schedule, and I told her about the double shifts on Thursdays. She asked if I had family support, and I said no. Not anymore. Not after I cut off my mother last night. Iris closed her notebook and said she needed to talk to Oliver alone. My chest got tight. I understood it was part of the process, but the thought of leaving him alone with a stranger made me want to throw up. I walked down the hall to his room and opened the door quietly. Oliver was curled up under his blankets, still sleeping. I sat on the edge of his bed and touched his shoulder gently. He opened his eyes and looked confused to see me there. I told him there was a nice lady here who wanted to ask him some questions about Grandma's house. His face changed immediately, got scared and small. I promised him he wasn't in trouble and that Iris was here to help keep him safe. He held onto my hand as we walked to the kitchen. I introduced him to Iris and she smiled at him, asked if they could talk in his room for a few minutes. Oliver looked at me and I nodded, told him it was okay. They went down the hall together and I heard his door close. I stood in the hallway pacing back and forth, straining to hear what they were saying, but the door was too thick. 20 minutes felt like hours. I kept checking my phone, watching the time tick by. Finally, Iris came out and Oliver stayed in his room. She asked me to sit back down at the table. She wanted to know more about my work schedule, our living situation, my support system. I admitted I work doubles every Thursday, that we're behind on rent, that I don't have family help anymore now that I've cut off my mother. Iris wrote it all down in her notebook. She said she'd need to do a home inspection and interview my mother as well, before making any choices about what happens next. I felt panic rising because I knew my mother would lie, would make herself look like a concerned grandmother just trying to help. Iris stood up and started walking through the apartment. She opened the kitchen cabinets and checked that we had food. She looked in the fridge and saw milk, eggs, sandwich stuff. She went to Oliver's room and examined it for anything dangerous, checked that his bed was clean and he had clothes in his dresser. She looked in the bathroom and made sure we had soap and towels. The whole time I followed her around feeling like I was judged for every small thing. Our apartment was small and cramped, but it was clean. We didn't have much, but Oliver had what he needed. Iris seemed okay with what she saw. Before she left, she told me not to contact my mother at all, not even to argue. She said to keep Oliver home from the school tomorrow because she needed to bring him to the CPS office for a medical exam. A doctor would look at the bruises and take photos for their records. I nodded and said we'd be there whenever she needed us. After Iris left, I stood in the kitchen trying to breathe normally. I had to call work and tell them I couldn't come in for my Thursday shift. I dialed Fletcher's number and he answered on the third ring. I explained that I had a family emergency and couldn't make it tomorrow. His voice got annoyed immediately. He said I was already on thin ice for missing shifts, that I'd called out before for Oliver's school stuff. I bit back tears and promised I'd make it up, work extra hours next week. Fletcher said we'd need to talk about my reliability when I came back, that he couldn't keep covering for me. I thanked him and hung up before he could say anything else that would make me cry. I spent the rest of the day trying to explain everything to Oliver in words a 6-year-old could understand. I told him some people needed to ask questions about his time at Grandma's house, that they wanted to make sure he was okay. He started crying and asked if he was in trouble. He asked if we were going to be homeless like Grandma said. I pulled him onto my lap and held him tight. I promised that I would never let anyone hurt him again, that even if we had to live in our car for a while, we'd figure it out together. He buried his face in my shoulder and I felt his tears soaking through my shirt. I rubbed his back and told him over and over that he was safe now, that Grandma couldn't hurt him anymore. That night, I put Oliver to bed early and sat in the living room trying to figure out what to do next. Around midnight, I heard screaming from his room. I ran down the hall and found him thrashing in his bed, tangled in his blankets. He was still asleep but crying and yelling. I grabbed him and held him close, trying to wake him up gently. When his eyes opened, he was sobbing, saying Grandma was angry and coming to get him. He kept saying he was sorry for telling secrets, that he didn't mean to make her mad. I rocked him back and forth like when he was a baby, telling him it was just a dream, that Grandma wasn't here and couldn't get to him. It took almost an hour before he calmed down enough to fall back asleep. I stayed in his room the rest of the night, sitting on the floor next to his bed, watching him breathe and praying tomorrow wouldn't be as bad as I thought it would be. Morning came too fast. I woke Oliver up and got him dressed in comfortable clothes. We drove to the CPS office in silence. Oliver held my hand so tight in the waiting room that my fingers went numb. A doctor called us back to an exam room. She was gentle and spoke softly to Oliver, explaining that she needed to look at where he got hurt. Oliver sat on the exam table, gripping my hand while the doctor took photos of every bruise. Some were already fading to yellow and green. The doctor asked Oliver to describe how each one happened, and he answered in a tiny voice I could barely hear. When she asked about the fingerprint marks on his arm, he started crying again. The doctor stopped and gave him a minute to calm down before continuing. She documented everything carefully, writing notes and taking measurements. The whole exam took almost an hour, and by the end, Oliver was exhausted and clinging to me. The doctor thanked him for being brave and told me someone would contact me about next steps. We walked out to the car and I buckled Oliver into his seat, wondering how much worse this was going to get before it got better. Iris touched my arm and asked if we could talk privately for a minute. I followed her to a small office down the hall while Oliver stayed with a CPS assistant, who gave him crayons and paper. Iris closed the door and sat across from me at a metal desk. She said the medical evidence clearly showed physical abuse happened to Oliver, and that my recording backed up his statements about what my mother did. I felt relief for about 2 seconds before she kept talking. She explained that CPS received a report from my mother claiming I neglect Oliver and leave him alone for long periods, that I'm unstable and possibly dangerous. Iris said they have to investigate both claims, that it's procedure when there are counter-allegations. My stomach hurt hearing that my mother's plan was working exactly like she wanted. Iris asked questions about my work schedule, how long Oliver stayed alone if ever, whether I had any history of mental health issues or substance use. I answered everything honestly, but my hands were shaking because I realized I was under investigation too, that my mother had flipped this around to make me look bad. Iris said she would need to do more home visits and interview people who knew me and Oliver. She told me not to worry if I had nothing to hide, but I was worried because my mother was convincing, and I was just a tired single mom who could barely keep up with bills. Saturday morning, my phone started ringing before 8. My aunt's name showed on the screen. I answered, and she immediately asked what was going on with my mother. Why was I causing so much trouble? She said my mother called her crying, devastated that I was accusing her of horrible things. My aunt said my mother claimed I was lying because I wanted to punish her for some made-up childhood problem, that I was being vindictive and cruel. I tried to explain about the bruises and the recording, but my aunt talked over me saying my mother would never hurt a child. She said I should be ashamed for making up stories about the woman who helped me so much. I hung up feeling sick. An hour later, my uncle called with the same speech. He said my mother told him I was having some kind of breakdown, that she was worried about Oliver's safety and my care. I realized my mother had spent days calling everyone in the family, building her story before I could defend myself. She painted herself as the victim, and me as the crazy daughter attacking her for no reason. Sunday afternoon, my uncle called again. This time he said my mother told him I leave Oliver alone for hours while I work, that she's been trying to help by watching him, but I'm ungrateful. He said I should thank my mother instead of making up abuse stories. I started explaining about the recording of her hitting Oliver, but he cut me off. He said recordings can be faked these days, that anyone can edit audio to make it sound like whatever they want. He told me I was clearly having a breakdown and needed help, that I was seeing things that weren't real. I tried to argue, but he said he didn't want to hear my excuses, that the family knew the truth about me. When he hung up, I sat on my couch staring at my phone, feeling everything crumble around me. My mother had turned them all against me in just a few days. By Monday morning, I had 5 missed calls and 3 voicemails from different relatives. I didn't listen to the messages because I already knew what they would say. My mother's version of events where she was the loving grandmother, and I was the unstable liar. I turned off my phone and focused on getting Oliver ready because I had to go back to work. I couldn't afford to miss another shift even though everything felt impossible. I walked next door and knocked on Adriana's apartment. She answered with her 2 kids hanging off her legs. I asked if she could watch Oliver for the day, that I'd pay her, and it was just temporary until I figured out permanent childcare. Adriana said yes, but she looked uncomfortable. She asked careful questions about why Oliver wasn't at the school or with his grandmother anymore. I gave vague answers about family issues and promised it wouldn't be for long. I could tell she wanted to ask more but didn't. I thanked her and left Oliver there, hating that I had to rely on a neighbor I barely knew. At work, I tried to focus on my tasks but kept messing up. I put boxes in the wrong section twice and nearly dropped a whole pallet because I wasn't paying attention. My supervisor, Fletcher, called me into his office around lunch. He closed the door and said I'd been distracted and unreliable lately, missing shifts and making mistakes that affected the whole team. I wanted to tell him about CPS and my mother and everything falling apart, but I was scared it would make things worse. Fletcher said he was putting me on a performance improvement plan, that I had 30 days to get my act together or I'd be fired. He said he understood people have personal problems, but this was a business and he needed workers he could count on. I nodded and promised I'd do better, then went back to work feeling like I was drowning. That evening, after I picked up Oliver from Adriana's and put him to bed, Iris called. She said she interviewed my mother that afternoon. My mother denied everything, claimed the recording was edited or taken out of context. She told CPS that I'm mentally unstable, that I've always been dramatic and attention-seeking since I was young. My mother said she's actually worried about Oliver's welfare living with me, that I can't provide proper care. Iris's voice was neutral and professional, but I could hear that my mother's performance worked. My mother knew how to sound reasonable and concerned, how to make me look like the problem. I felt panic rising in my chest because what if CPS believed her? What if they thought I was the dangerous one? I asked Iris what happens next, and she said the investigation would take several weeks to complete. They'd interview Oliver's teacher, his doctor, anyone who has regular contact with him. She said I needed to maintain stable housing and employment, make sure Oliver attended school regularly, and cooperate fully with all CPS requests. I wrote everything down even though my hand was shaking. Iris said she'd be doing random home visits to check on our living situation and Oliver's well-being. She reminded me not to have any contact with my mother during the investigation. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by bills I couldn't pay and felt completely alone. The next day, I took Oliver to his first appointment with Caitlin Gibson, a child therapist who works with trauma cases. The office was in a small building across town, and the waiting room had toys and kids' books everywhere. Oliver held my hand tight and said he didn't want to talk about Grandma anymore, that he just wanted to forget it. Caitlin came out to get us, and she was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s with a calm way of speaking. She took Oliver back to her office alone while I waited. I could hear muffled voices through the door but couldn't make out words. After 40 minutes, they came back out and Oliver looked tired but okay. Caitlin asked if she could speak with me privately for a few minutes. We went into her office while Oliver played in the waiting room where I could see him through the window. Caitlin said Oliver showed clear signs of trauma and anxiety related to his grandmother. She explained that healing would be a long process, that I should expect behavioral regression, nightmares, and emotional outbursts as he processes everything that happened. She said kids his age often act out or seem to get worse before they get better. Caitlin gave me a list of strategies for supporting Oliver at home and scheduled weekly sessions going forward. She said she'd be documenting his progress and sharing updates with CPS as part of their investigation. I thanked her and took Oliver home, adding therapy copays to the growing list of expenses I couldn't afford. The bills started coming faster than I could open them. Medical copays for Oliver's therapy sessions, $50 each week that I didn't have. Lost wages from every appointment I had to attend, every early pickup from the school. I gave Adriana $40 for watching Oliver during my shifts, knowing it wasn't enough, but it was all I could spare. The rent was due again, and I was already 1 month behind from before everything happened. I kept the envelope from the landlord unopened on the kitchen counter for 2 days before I finally looked inside. 30-day notice to pay or vacate. 2 months back rent plus late fees or we were out. My whole body shook, but I kept the sounds trapped in my throat because I couldn't let him know how bad things were getting. Oliver wet the bed 3 nights in a row starting that weekend. He hadn't had an accident since he was 4 years old, but now I was washing sheets every morning before work. He stood in the bathroom doorway while I showered, asking every few minutes if I was still there. When I tried to close the door, he started crying and saying he needed to see me. At the school, his teacher called to say he wasn't participating in group activities anymore, just sat alone during free time staring at nothing. She said he used to love art projects and now he wouldn't even pick up a crayon. I watched my son disappearing into himself and felt like my mother was still hurting him even though she was gone. The guilt sat heavy in my chest every time I looked at him. This was supposed to make things better, but he was getting worse, and I didn't know how to fix it. I broke down at work during my lunch break the following Tuesday. Sat in the warehouse break room with my head in my hands, trying not to make noise while tears ran down my face. The door opened and I tried to wipe my eyes fast, but Benjamin walked in and saw everything. He didn't leave or pretend not to notice, just sat down across from me and asked what was wrong in this gentle voice that made me cry harder. Something about someone being kind after weeks of everything falling apart just broke something open in me. I told him about my mother hitting Oliver, about CPS investigating me, about the eviction notice and losing shifts for appointments and being terrified I was going to lose my job on top of everything else. He listened to all of it without interrupting or judging. When I finished, he said he could cover some of my shifts when I needed to handle appointments. Said Fletcher didn't need to know why. Benjamin would just tell him he wanted the extra hours. Benjamin told me his sister went through a CPS investigation years ago when her ex made false reports trying to get custody. He said it was terrible and scary, but she came out the other side and her kids were fine now. It was the first time anyone had said something that made me think this might actually end someday. That Oliver and I might survive this and be okay eventually. I'd been so focused on just getting through each day that I hadn't let myself think past the immediate crisis. Hearing that someone else made it through gave me this tiny bit of hope I didn't know I needed. I thanked him about 5 times and he just shrugged and said that's what coworkers do for each other. But I knew it was more than that because most people had stayed away from me once they heard about the CPS stuff. Iris showed up at my apartment on Thursday evening without calling first. I opened the door and felt my stomach drop, thinking something bad must have happened for her to just appear like that. She said she was doing a random home visit to check on our living situation. I let her in and she walked through the apartment looking at everything. Oliver was at the kitchen table doing homework, and I was helping him sound out words for his reading assignment. The dishes were washed, the floor was swept, there was food in the refrigerator. Iris seemed pleased with what she saw and made notes on her clipboard. She reminded me the investigation was still ongoing, and I needed to keep things stable consistently, not just when she visited. Then she mentioned that my mother had been calling the CPS office multiple times a week, insisting I was coaching Oliver to lie about the abuse. Her voice stayed professional, but I could hear the warning underneath. My mother was still trying to destroy me even from a distance. The next week, Oliver had a complete meltdown at the school. The teacher called me at work saying he was screaming and throwing things at another student who asked to share the building blocks. I told Fletcher I had an emergency and needed to leave right away. He followed me to the time clock saying I was becoming unreliable and he couldn't keep making exceptions for me. Said if I left, I shouldn't bother coming back. I kept walking because Oliver needed me and I'd figure out the job situation later. Benjamin caught up with me in the parking lot and said he'd talk to Fletcher, that he'd finish my shift so Fletcher couldn't say I abandoned my work. I drove to the school with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, knowing I was probably fired, but having no choice except to get my son. Oliver was in the principal's office when I got there, sitting in a chair with his arms wrapped around himself. His face was red and tear-stained, and he wouldn't look at me when I walked in. The teacher explained what happened and kept using words like aggressive and inappropriate behavior. I wanted to scream that my 6-year-old was traumatized and scared and none of this was his fault, but I just nodded and signed the incident report. Took Oliver home and called Caitlin to ask for an emergency appointment. She fit us in the next morning even though her schedule was full. Caitlin explained that Oliver's meltdown was a trauma response. Said he was on high alert for threats all the time now, and his ability to control his emotions was damaged by what my mother did. She used the term hypervigilant and said Oliver saw danger even in normal kid situations like sharing toys. His brain was stuck in survival mode and couldn't tell the difference between real threats and everyday conflicts. She wrote a letter to his school explaining his situation and asking for accommodations like extra time to calm down and a quiet space he could go to when overwhelmed. I felt grateful that someone understood what was happening and was willing to help. But I also felt devastated that my 6-year-old needed this level of support because of what my mother had done to him. He should be playing and learning and being a normal kid, not needing special accommodations for trauma. Iris called that afternoon and said she wanted to connect me with someone who could help. She gave me the name Archie Merritt and a phone number for legal aid. Said he worked with parents going through CPS investigations and could explain my rights. I called right away and got an appointment for the next day. Archie's office was in a small building downtown with worn carpet and old furniture. He was maybe 50 with gray hair and reading glasses and a calm way of talking that made me feel less panicked. He reviewed everything I'd brought, the audio recording, the photos of bruises, the medical reports, the therapy notes. He said the recording was powerful evidence, but my mother's counter-allegations made things more complicated. The system had to investigate both sides even when one side was clearly lying. He offered to represent me for free if things escalated to family court, and said he'd help me understand the process. I asked how much I owed him, and he said legal aid didn't charge for CPS cases because most parents couldn't afford attorneys. I almost cried again from relief. Archie told me to document everything from now on. Every therapy session, every school incident, every expense related to Oliver's care, every contact from my mother or CPS. He said I needed to build a timeline showing my mother's abuse and my appropriate response to it. We spent 2 hours organizing all my evidence into a folder with dates and descriptions and copies of everything important. He explained my rights during the investigation and what to expect at each stage. For the first time since Iris knocked on my door that morning, I felt like someone was on my side who actually understood how the system worked. Someone who believed me and was helping me fight back instead of just telling me what I was doing wrong. My mother called from a number I didn't recognize 3 days later. I didn't answer, but she left a voicemail that made my hands shake when I listened to it. Her voice kept changing between angry and sweet, like she couldn't decide which approach would work better. She said I was destroying our family over nothing, that she only ever loved Oliver and wanted what was best for him, called me mentally ill for believing a child's exaggerations, and said I was obviously having some kind of breakdown. Then her voice got hard, and she said CPS would see through my lies eventually, that she was going to make sure Oliver was placed somewhere safe, away from me. The message ended, and I played it 3 more times to make sure I heard everything correctly. My mother was threatening to take my son away from me while pretending she was the victim in all this. I called Archie the next morning and played my mother's voicemail on speaker. He listened without interrupting, then asked me to email him the audio file right away. He said threats and harassment helped prove her manipulative behavior, showed the judge exactly who she was. He drafted a cease and desist letter that afternoon and walked me through filing for a protection order. The paperwork felt endless, pages asking for dates and details and specific incidents. I wrote everything down while Oliver watched cartoons in the next room, trying to keep my handwriting steady when my hands wanted to shake. Archie explained that the protection order would legally prevent my mother from contacting either of us, but we needed a court hearing first. He filed the petition that same day and said we'd get a hearing date within 2 weeks. The hearing got scheduled for a Thursday, which meant asking Fletcher for another day off. I called him during my lunch break and explained I had a court date. He went quiet for a long moment, then asked how many more emergencies I was planning to have. I told him this was the last one, that after the hearing things would settle down. He said he'd heard that before and that I needed to decide if I wanted to work or deal with family drama. I promised I'd be back Friday and wouldn't miss any more shifts. He hung up without saying goodbye. 2 days before the hearing, Fletcher called me into his office at the end of my shift. I knew before he said anything. He told me I was fired effective immediately, that he couldn't run a warehouse with workers who disappeared every other week. I begged him for one more chance, reminded him I'd worked there for 3 years without any problems until recently. He said recent was all that mattered, that I should have put my job first instead of getting caught up in family drama. He handed me my final paycheck and told me to clear out my locker. Benjamin was waiting by the time clock when I came out. He'd heard Fletcher yelling through the office door. I couldn't even cry, just stood there holding my box of stuff while Benjamin offered to help carry it to my car. Losing my job hit me like a physical thing, made my chest tight and my vision narrow. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes trying to breathe normally. No job meant no money for rent or food or gas. I had maybe $400 in my checking account and $200 in cash that Benjamin had given me last week. That was everything. I drove to the unemployment office straight from the warehouse and filled out the application on their public computers. The woman at the desk said it would take 4 to 6 weeks to process, and I might not qualify anyway since I was fired for attendance issues. I wanted to explain about Oliver and CPS and my mother, but she was already calling the next number. Adriana knocked on my door that evening after I picked Oliver up from the school. She'd heard from Benjamin about me getting fired. She said she'd watch Oliver for free during the day while I looked for work, that her kids liked having him around anyway. I tried to thank her but started crying instead, and she hugged me while Oliver played with her youngest son in the living room. Benjamin called an hour later and said he was dropping off some money. I told him I couldn't take any more from him, but he said it wasn't a loan this time, just help. He left $200 in an envelope in my mailbox. I sat at my kitchen table counting the cash 3 times, trying to figure out how to stretch $600 until unemployment came through or I found another job. I spent every minute Oliver was at the school applying for jobs online. Warehouse positions, retail, fast food, anything that might hire someone with my work history. Most applications asked about availability, and I had to be honest about needing flexibility for therapy appointments and school meetings. Every place wanted someone who could work any shift, weekends, holidays, whatever they needed. I couldn't promise that. The rejection emails started coming within hours. We regret to inform you. Not a good fit at this time. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. Each one felt like proof that my mother was right, that I couldn't provide for my son, that we'd end up homeless just like she'd threatened. Iris showed up for another home visit 3 days after I lost my job. She asked how things were going, and I had to tell her I was unemployed. Her expression didn't change, but she started writing more notes. She asked about my financial situation, my backup plans, how I planned to pay rent and bills. I showed her my job applications, 24 of them across multiple websites. I showed her the unemployment paperwork and the small amount of cash I had left. I explained that Adriana was helping with childcare, and Benjamin had loaned me money. She wrote everything down, asked if I had family who could help financially. I said no, that I'd cut off contact with my mother, and the rest of my family sided with her. Iris made more notes, and I couldn't tell from her face if she thought I was handling things responsibly or falling apart. She asked to see Oliver's room and checked that he still had clean clothes and a safe bed. Before she left, she reminded me that stable housing and employment were important factors in their ongoing assessment. The protection order hearing arrived, and I had to face my mother for the first time since our midnight confrontation. Archie met me outside the courthouse and walked me through what would happen. We sat on a bench in the hallway waiting for our case to be called. My mother arrived with a lawyer I didn't recognize, some man in an expensive suit who kept his hand on her elbow like she needed help walking. She looked smaller than I remembered, older somehow. She was wearing her church clothes and had done her hair in soft curls, playing the sweet grandmother role. Her lawyer approached Archie and suggested we settle this outside court, said my mother just wanted to see her grandson, and didn't understand why I was being so hostile. Archie said we had nothing to discuss and walked me away before I could respond. Inside the courtroom, my mother sat with her lawyer on one side while Archie and I sat on the other. The judge called our case and asked each side to present their arguments. My mother's lawyer went first, painting her as a confused elderly woman who dedicated her retirement to helping with childcare. He said I was having some kind of mental health crisis and using the legal system to punish my mother for normal grandparental discipline. He claimed the audio recording was taken out of context, that all grandparents occasionally have to correct misbehaving children. He asked the judge to dismiss the protection order request and consider whether I was fit to make decisions about my son's care. Archie stood up and played the audio recording for the judge. 4 minutes of my mother hitting Oliver, threatening him, telling him he'd be homeless if he told anyone. The judge listened with a neutral expression while my mother's face went hard. When it ended, Archie presented the medical photos of Oliver's bruises and the therapist's report documenting his trauma symptoms. He showed the judge Oliver's statements to CPS about being grabbed and hit. My mother's lawyer objected, said the recording was inflammatory, and that bruises proved nothing since all children get hurt playing. The judge held up her hand and asked my mother directly if that was her voice on the recording. My mother said yes, but insisted it was taken out of context, that modern parents don't understand proper child discipline. She said she'd raised 4 children the same way, and they'd all turned out fine. The judge asked pointed questions about the specific bruises and what Oliver had told the CPS investigator. My mother kept saying she'd never hurt Oliver, that she loved him and only wanted what was best. The judge asked her to explain the threats on the recording about homelessness. My mother said she was trying to help Oliver understand consequences, that children need to learn the world isn't always fair. The judge made notes and asked if there was anything else either side wanted to present. Archie mentioned my mother's harassing voicemail and played that too. My mother's lawyer objected again, but the judge had already heard it. The judge granted a temporary protection order preventing my mother from contacting me or Oliver until the CPS investigation concluded. She said the evidence clearly showed concerning behavior that warranted keeping distance between my mother and my son. My mother stood up immediately and started yelling that I was poisoning her grandson against her, that she had rights as a grandmother. The judge warned her about contempt of court. My mother kept talking, saying I'd always been a liar and a troublemaker, that everyone in the family knew I was unstable. The judge told her to sit down or face additional consequences. My mother finally stopped talking but stayed standing, staring at me with pure hatred. Her lawyer pulled her back into her chair while she continued glaring. The judge said the protection order was effective immediately, and that violation would result in arrest. After court ended, Archie and I walked toward the exit while my mother and her lawyer stayed behind talking. She saw us leaving and rushed into the hallway after us. Archie stepped between us before she could get close and reminded her about the protection order that had just been issued. My mother hissed that I'd regret this, that she'd make sure everyone knew what a terrible mother I was. She said I was destroying our family, and that my son would hate me someday for keeping him from his grandmother. Security guards appeared and asked if there was a problem. Archie showed them the protection order paperwork and explained that my mother was violating it already. They escorted her toward the exit while she kept looking back at me. I was shaking so hard I had to lean against the wall. Archie asked if I was okay and I nodded even though I wasn't. I'd just permanently destroyed my relationship with my mother, and probably most of my extended family. There was no going back from this. That night after Oliver went to bed, someone knocked on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw my landlord holding papers. I knew what they were before I opened the door. He handed me formal eviction papers giving me 30 days to vacate the premises. He said I was 3 months behind on rent, and he'd been patient but couldn't wait anymore. I tried to explain about losing my job and promised I'd catch up as soon as unemployment came through. He said he'd heard that before from other tenants and it never worked out. The eviction was already filed with the court. I had 30 days to either pay everything I owed or move out. He left and I stood in my doorway holding the papers, reading the same sentences over and over. 30 days to vacate. 3 months rent owed plus late fees. Legal action if I didn't comply. I sat at my kitchen table with all the paperwork spread out in front of me. Eviction notice, unemployment application, job rejection emails, protection order, CPS case file. I was unemployed, being investigated by CPS and about to be homeless with a traumatized 6-year-old. I had $600 and no family support and no idea how to fix any of it. Every path forward seemed to lead to disaster. Even if I found a job tomorrow, I couldn't pay 3 months back rent plus current rent plus deposits on a new place. Even if unemployment came through, it wouldn't be enough to cover everything. I thought about my mother's threat that we'd end up homeless and realized she might actually be right. I'd protected Oliver from her abuse, but now I couldn't protect him from the consequences of that choice. I put my head down on the table and tried to think of any solution that didn't end with us living in my car. I spent that night sitting at the table, staring at papers until the words blurred together. Eventually, I moved to the couch and lay there in the dark, not sleeping, just counting hours until morning. Around 6, I gave up trying to rest and got dressed. Oliver was still asleep, so I grabbed my keys and went outside to sit in my car. Couldn't face being inside that apartment knowing we had 30 days before we'd be thrown out. I put my head on the steering wheel and tried to think of anyone I could call for help. The list was empty. A knock on my window made me jump. Adriana stood there in her bathrobe holding 2 coffee cups. I rolled down the window and she handed me one through the gap. She asked if I was okay, and I shook my head because lying seemed pointless. She opened the passenger door and climbed in without asking, settling into the seat like we did this every morning. I told her about the eviction notice, about being 3 months behind on rent with no way to catch up. The words came out flat and tired because I'd cried myself empty the night before. Adriana sipped her coffee and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said her cousin managed a smaller building across town with cheaper units. She pulled out her phone right there and called him, explaining my situation in vague terms about family trouble and job loss. I heard him agree to show me a 1-bedroom that afternoon. Adriana wrote the address on a napkin from her pocket and told me to go at 2. She said the rent was $200 less than what I paid now, and her cousin was flexible about deposits for people she vouched for. I started crying again, this time from relief instead of despair. She patted my shoulder and said that's what neighbors do, then climbed out and headed back to her apartment. I sat there holding the napkin like it was made of gold, feeling the first small bit of hope I'd had in days. I went back inside and got Oliver ready for school. Dropped him off and drove straight to the library to use their computers for job applications. Spent 3 hours filling out forms and uploading my resume to every warehouse in the area. My phone rang around 11 and I almost didn't answer because I thought it might be my mother or another family member. But the number looked familiar, so I picked up. Benjamin's voice came through asking if I had a minute to talk. He said his warehouse was hiring for evening shift positions, and he'd already talked to his supervisor about me. They wanted to interview me as soon as possible, preferably tomorrow. I said yes immediately, and he gave me the address and time. Told me to mention his name and that the supervisor knew about my need for flexible scheduling. I thanked him 3 times before hanging up, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. 2 possible solutions in one morning felt impossible after weeks of everything going wrong. I practiced interview answers in my car before picking up Oliver from the school. Rehearsed explanations for my employment gap that mentioned family emergency without going into details about CPS or abuse. Wrote down questions to ask about schedule flexibility and start dates. By the time I got Oliver, I had a basic script memorized. That evening after he went to bed, I tried on my 3 work-appropriate shirts to see which looked most professional. Settled on a plain blue one that didn't have any stains and ironed it carefully. Set my alarm for early so I'd have time to look put together. The interview lasted 20 minutes. The supervisor was a woman named Rita who looked tired but kind. She asked about my previous warehouse experience and why I left my last job. I stuck to my prepared answer about family circumstances requiring immediate attention and needing more schedule flexibility going forward. Rita nodded like she'd heard similar stories before. She explained the evening shift ran from 4 to midnight Monday through Friday. Pay was $1 less per hour than my previous job, but they offered benefits after 90 days. I asked about requesting time off for appointments, and she said as long as I gave notice, they could usually accommodate. She offered me the position right there and asked when I could start. I said Monday, and she handed me paperwork to fill out. And I signed everything with my hands still shaking slightly, hardly believing this was real. I picked up Oliver from Adriana's and drove straight to the address she'd given me. The building was older and smaller than where we lived, located in a neighborhood that looked rougher around the edges. But the apartment itself was clean and recently painted. 1 bedroom with a tiny kitchen and bathroom. The living room was barely big enough for a couch and TV. Adriana's cousin showed me around and explained the lease terms. First month plus security deposit, utilities not included, coin laundry in the basement. The rent was manageable with my new job, and the deposit was half what I expected. I told him I'd take it, and he said he could have the lease ready to sign tomorrow. I asked if we could move in this weekend, and he agreed. Walking out of that building, I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time in weeks. I had a job starting Monday and a place to live by this weekend. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep us off the street. That evening, I started packing while Oliver did homework, pulled boxes from the closet, and began sorting through our belongings. Threw out things we didn't need and organized everything else by room. Oliver asked why we were packing, and I told him we were moving to a new apartment that would be a fun adventure. He looked worried and asked if Grandma knew where the new place was. I promised him she didn't and wouldn't, that the protection order meant she couldn't come near us anywhere. He seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to his homework. I packed late into the night, grateful to have concrete tasks to focus on instead of spiraling into panic. Oliver had therapy with Caitlin on Thursday afternoon. I dropped him off and waited in the lobby like usual, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. After 40 minutes, Caitlin came out and asked if I could join them. Her face looked serious, but not alarmed. I followed her back to the playroom where Oliver sat on the floor with toy figures scattered around him. Caitlin sat in her chair and explained that Oliver had shared some new information about his grandmother today. She said he'd given specific details about the abuse that he hadn't told anyone before. Oliver looked at me with scared eyes, and I told him it was okay, that he wasn't in trouble. Caitlin asked if Oliver could repeat what he'd told her. He picked up 2 toy figures and demonstrated how Grandma would grab his arm really hard and shake him while yelling in his face. He said she squeezed so tight it left marks and wouldn't let go even when he cried. Then he said Grandma told him that if he ever told anyone what happened, I would go to jail and he'd have to live with strangers who would be even meaner than her. He said that's why he didn't tell before, because he didn't want me to go to jail. My chest felt tight listening to him describe the threats my mother used to keep him silent. Caitlin documented everything he said and told me she'd be sharing this with Iris as part of the investigation. She said Oliver's disclosure was very important and showed how much he trusted us to keep him safe now. Iris called me the next morning while I was packing dishes. She said Oliver's disclosure to Caitlin was the turning point they needed. Combined with the audio recording, medical evidence of bruises, and Oliver's consistent statements to multiple people, they had clear proof of abuse by my mother. She explained that they were closing the investigation into me because there was no evidence supporting my mother's claims about my parenting. Everything pointed to my mother being the abuser and me being the protective parent who reported it. Iris said they were filing a report with law enforcement about my mother's actions and flagging her in the system. I asked what would happen to my mother, and Iris said that was up to the police and prosecutors now. She told me I'd done everything right by protecting Oliver and cooperating fully with their investigation. I sat down on the floor surrounded by half-packed boxes and cried with relief. For weeks I'd been scared that CPS would take Oliver away despite the evidence. Hearing that the case was closed felt like a weight lifting off my chest. I called Archie right after and told him about the CPS decision. He said that was great news, but warned me not to expect criminal charges against my mother. He explained that elder abuse of children rarely led to prosecution unless there was severe injury requiring hospitalization. Most of the time, the system treated it as a family matter instead of a crime. He said the best outcome was probably that my mother would be flagged in the CPS system and prevented from providing childcare for other kids. It felt wrong that she wouldn't face real consequences for beating Oliver, but Archie said that's just how these cases usually went. At least the CPS investigation was over and my mother couldn't use the system against me anymore. Moving day came that Saturday with rain pouring down all morning. Benjamin showed up at 8 with his truck, and Adriana brought her husband to help carry furniture. We loaded everything in 3 trips, getting soaked each time we went outside. Oliver rode with me to the new apartment and helped unpack his toys in the bedroom we'd share. I set up his bed first and arranged his stuffed animals exactly how he liked them. He seemed okay with the new place once his familiar things were around him, but he kept asking if Grandma knew our new address and if she could find us here. I assured him multiple times that she didn't know where we lived, and the protection order meant she wasn't allowed to come near us. Benjamin and Adriana stayed until everything was moved in and mostly unpacked. They left around dinner time, and I ordered pizza to celebrate our first night in the new apartment. Oliver and I ate sitting on the floor because I hadn't set up the table yet. He said the place was smaller, but he liked having his own corner for toys. I told him we were safe here, and that was what mattered most. Iris came for a final home visit on Tuesday evening. She walked through the apartment checking that we had food, appropriate sleeping arrangements, and a safe environment. She seemed pleased with everything and sat down at my newly assembled kitchen table to go over paperwork. She told me officially that the investigation was closed with no findings of neglect or abuse by me. She said I'd done exactly what a protective parent should do by reporting my mother and removing Oliver from the dangerous situation. Iris mentioned she'd seen too many cases where parents chose the abuser over the child because of family pressure or financial need. She said my choice to protect Oliver, even when it cost me everything, showed I was putting his safety first. Her words made me start crying, and I apologized for getting emotional. She said it was a normal reaction after weeks of stress and uncertainty. Before she left, she gave me resource information for continued therapy and support services. She shook my hand and said she hoped she'd never have to see us again in a professional capacity. Archie helped me file paperwork to make the protection order permanent the following week. We went to court on Thursday morning and sat in the waiting area for 2 hours before our case was called. My mother didn't show up, which Archie said was common when abusers realized they'd lost control of the situation. The judge reviewed all the evidence, including the CPS findings and Oliver's therapy records. He granted the permanent protection order prohibiting my mother from contacting me or Oliver for the next 3 years. After that, we'd have to renew it if needed. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt strange, like something heavy had been lifted, but also like I'd lost something I could never get back. I'd permanently cut ties with my mother and most of my extended family, but I'd also protected my son from further abuse and given him a chance to heal. Archie said I'd made the right choice even though it was hard. I knew he was right, but that didn't make it hurt less. 6 weeks after we moved into the new apartment, Oliver stopped waking up screaming every night. The nightmares that had him thrashing and crying out for the first month started happening only twice a week, then once, then not at all for days at a time. I'd stand outside his bedroom door listening to him breathe steady and calm, hardly believing the change. Caitlin told me during our Thursday session that Oliver was making real progress in therapy. She said he was learning to talk about his feelings instead of keeping them locked inside where they turned into bad dreams. He could name his emotions now and understand that what my mother did wasn't his fault, that he didn't deserve to be hit no matter what he did wrong. She showed me drawings he'd made during their sessions, pictures that started dark and violent but slowly added color and happy elements over the weeks. I could see my son coming back to himself, the kid who used to laugh and play without fear starting to peek through again. He still had rough days where he'd get quiet and withdrawn, especially on Thursdays, even though he wasn't going anywhere near my mother. But those days were getting less frequent, and the good days were starting to outnumber them. My phone rang one evening while I was making dinner, and I let it go to voicemail because I didn't recognize the number. Later, I listened to the message and heard my aunt's voice, hesitant and apologetic. She said she was sorry for not believing me at first, that she'd seen my mother at a family gathering last weekend, and something about her behavior made everything click into place. My mother had snapped at one of my cousin's kids for spilling juice, her voice going sharp and mean in a way that apparently made everyone uncomfortable. My aunt said she kept thinking about that recording I'd tried to tell her about, and maybe I had been telling the truth all along. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and felt nothing except tired. Part of me wanted to call her back and tell her exactly how much damage her disbelief had caused, how alone I'd felt when my whole family chose my abuser over me and my son. But I didn't have the energy for that fight, and I wasn't ready to let anyone back in who had sided against us when it mattered most. I saved the voicemail anyway, filing it away as proof that maybe someday, years from now, some family connections might be worth trying to repair. 3 months after Iris closed the CPS investigation, my supervisor pulled me aside at work and told me I was getting a small raise. It wasn't much, just 50 cents more per hour, but it meant an extra $80 in my paycheck every 2 weeks. I almost cried right there in the warehouse because that money meant I could start putting something aside for emergencies, instead of living paycheck to paycheck to paycheck with nothing left over. Benjamin had become a real friend by then, not just a coworker who covered my shifts. He'd text me on weekends to check how Oliver and I were doing, and sometimes he'd bring us leftovers from his family dinners because his mom always cooked too much. Adriana's kids started having regular playdates with Oliver every Saturday afternoon, giving me 3 hours to grocery shop or clean, or just sit quietly without having to be on alert. These people who had no obligation to help us kept showing up anyway, building something steady underneath us that felt nothing like the family support I'd lost. They didn't help because we were related, or because they felt guilty, or because they wanted something in return. They helped because they chose to, because they'd seen us at our worst and decided we were worth sticking around for. Oliver's teacher called me one Tuesday to schedule a parent conference, and I felt my stomach drop, expecting bad news. But when I sat down in her classroom that Thursday, she smiled and told me Oliver was doing so much better. He'd started raising his hand to answer questions again, and volunteering to help with classroom jobs. He'd made a best friend named Jason who sat with him at lunch every day, and the two of them were inseparable on the playground. She said his reading scores had improved and he was participating in group activities without the anxiety that used to make him shut down. There were still moments when he needed extra support, times when he'd get overwhelmed and need to sit quietly in the reading corner until he felt steady again. But overall, he was becoming the engaged, happy student she'd seen glimpses of before everything fell apart. I attended every parent-teacher conference after that and showed up to every school event, sitting in the audience for his class performance and volunteering for field trip supervision. I was determined to be present in ways my mother had never been for me, to show Oliver that he mattered enough for me to be there. I started seeing my own therapist in April, scheduling appointments during my lunch breaks at work. Talking about my childhood felt like pulling out splinters that had been buried under my skin for 30 years, painful and necessary. I told my therapist about the bruises I'd hidden as a kid, the fear I'd felt around my mother, the way I'd convinced myself it was normal because I didn't have anything else to compare it to. She helped me understand why I'd missed the signs with Oliver at first, why I'd made excuses and waited so long before acting. I'd been trained since childhood to minimize my mother's violence, to believe that discipline and abuse were the same thing, to protect my abuser because that's what family did. Breaking that pattern meant looking at my own past honestly, admitting that I'd been hurt too, and that hurt had shaped how I saw the world. It was hard work that left me drained after every session, but I knew I had to do it if I wanted to make sure the cycle stopped with me. The financial pressure started easing around the same time, not because I was making more money, but because I got better at stretching what I had. I learned which grocery stores had the best sales, and started meal planning instead of buying random ingredients that went bad in the fridge. We qualified for assistance programs that helped with food stamps and utility bills, support I'd been too proud to apply for at first. I'd felt ashamed walking into the social services office, like accepting help meant I'd failed as a parent. But my therapist helped me see it differently, as temporary support while I rebuilt our stability rather than a permanent handout. Oliver and I were making it work day by day in our small apartment with our small but solid support system, and that was enough. 6 months after I'd cut off all contact with my mother, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox from a law office I didn't recognize. Inside was a legal petition for grandparents' visitation rights, my mother's lawyer arguing that she had a right to see Oliver and that I was unfairly keeping them apart. My hands shook reading the formal language that painted my mother as a loving grandmother being denied access to her grandchild by a vindictive daughter. I called Archie immediately and he told me to bring him the paperwork that same day. He read through everything carefully, then started drafting a response citing the documented abuse, the active protection order, and Oliver's ongoing trauma treatment. He assured me that no judge would grant my mother access given everything in the case file, but I could tell from his voice that even frivolous petitions had to be taken seriously. The attempt rattled me more than I wanted to admit, proof that my mother wasn't done trying to control us even after everything that had happened. 2 weeks later, Archie called to tell me the petition had been dismissed. The judge had reviewed the case file, including all the CPS findings and Oliver's therapy records, and ruled that my mother's documented abuse made her petition essentially worthless. There would be no hearing, no need for me to face her in court again, no chance of her getting any access to Oliver. Archie explained that the legal system had definitively sided with Oliver's safety over my mother's claimed rights as a grandmother. I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding tight, a final sense of closure knowing that the courts had our backs. Oliver told me one night before bed that he felt safe now, his small voice clear in the darkness of his room. He said he didn't worry anymore about Grandma finding us or coming to take him away. He liked our new apartment even though it was smaller, and he liked having Jason as his best friend at the school. He said Adriana and Benjamin felt like family now, the kind who showed up and helped without making him scared. I tucked his blanket around him and kissed his forehead, and his words made me realize we'd actually built something real and good from all the wreckage. We were genuinely okay, not just surviving, but actually living without fear hanging over us every day. My supervisor at work pulled me into his office one morning in late May and told me they were promoting me to shift supervisor. The position came with better pay and more stable hours, letting me work mostly day shifts instead of the rotating schedule that had made everything harder. It wasn't a huge change, but it meant I could start saving a real emergency fund and catch up completely on bills that had been hanging over my head for months. Benjamin joked that I was his boss now, and he'd have to start calling me ma'am, and I laughed because it felt good to have something positive happen that I'd earned through my own work. I felt proud that I'd rebuilt my employment stability despite everything that had tried to knock me down, that I'd proven I could provide for Oliver without my mother's help or anyone else's charity. A year after the CPS investigation closed, I sat in Caitlin's office while she reviewed Oliver's progress notes. She looked up and told me they could reduce his sessions to twice monthly instead of weekly. Oliver had developed healthy ways to handle his feelings, and his fear responses had gotten much better. He'd always carry some effects from what my mother did, but he was strong and doing great in his new life. I felt relief wash over me knowing we'd reached this point, that the weekly therapy appointments could finally ease up. Oliver waited in the lobby doing a puzzle, not anxious about being there anymore like he used to be. Caitlin said his nightmares had almost stopped completely, and he was participating in the school activities without the constant worry that used to follow him everywhere. She scheduled our next appointment for 2 weeks out and said to call if anything changed, but she expected Oliver would continue improving at this steady pace. The following Saturday, I took Oliver to the zoo, just the two of us, packing sandwiches and juice boxes in my backpack. He ran ahead between exhibits, stopping to press his face against the glass at the penguin habitat and calling back to me about how they swim underwater. He grabbed my hand as we walked to the monkey area, chattering about the animal unit his class was studying, and how his teacher said gorillas are really smart. I watched him laugh and point at the baby monkeys playing, completely focused on the moment without that shadow of fear that used to cloud his eyes. He asked if we could come back next month and see the new lion cubs, already planning ahead instead of just surviving day to day. Standing there in the warm sunshine watching my son be a normal, happy kid, I understood what safety actually looked like. This was healing. This was what we'd fought so hard to reach, and we'd actually made it through to the other side. My relationship with most of my family stayed broken, with relatives either believing my mother's lies or staying quiet to avoid picking sides. My aunt never called back after that one apology message. My uncle sent a Christmas card last year but didn't include a return address or phone number. Most of them chose comfort over truth, chose my mother over protecting Oliver. I'd made peace with losing them because keeping Oliver safe mattered more than maintaining relationships with people who enabled abuse. The family I'd chosen meant more anyway. Benjamin covered my shifts without complaint when Oliver had bad days. Adriana brought dinner over twice a month and her kids played with Oliver every weekend. Archie still checked in every few months to make sure we were okay. Caitlin had become more than just Oliver's therapist, offering advice and support beyond our scheduled sessions. These people showed up when things were hard, stuck around when it would have been easier to walk away, and that counted for more than shared blood ever did. Oliver and I settled into our normal life where most days felt genuinely good instead of just survivable. We had our small apartment with his drawings covering the fridge and his toys organized in bins along the wall. My paycheck covered rent and groceries with a little left over for savings each month. Benjamin came over for dinner sometimes and Oliver called him uncle, which made Benjamin grin every time. Adriana's daughter had a sleepover at our place last weekend, and I heard them giggling until midnight. Oliver brought home good grades and talked about his friends at the school, made plans for summer activities, asked for a pet hamster. I looked at my son thriving despite everything he went through, saw him playing video games on the couch without fear hanging over him, heard him laugh at silly jokes, and I knew cutting off my mother was the best decision I ever made. It cost me almost everything else, left me isolated from most of my family and struggling financially for months. But Oliver was safe and happy and healing. That was worth every sacrifice, every hard choice, every door I had to close to protect him. We built something good from all that wreckage, and watching him grow up free from abuse made all of it worthwhile.